Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Allen with Gaber.io, and I'm here today with Pablo Lascurain. I think I got that right. Who works at Dissent Ventures, Four Founders, and InDip, among other things. I think it's evening in your case, correct, Pablo?
Yeah, we're around 6:35, something like that.
Okay, so about the same as us. You're only an hour behind us. So how are you doing tonight?
All good. Very excited about being in the second half of 2024, working in different things that I'm sure we're gonna get into that in a bit. But I'm happy to join us, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. And so we'll start with, can you just tell us about your background and some of the key achievements you've accomplished at your many ventures?
I'll try to find some achievements, but okay, in the very specific way of startups and venture capital, I have started to date 13 companies. Myself, I sold 4 of them. Not all of them were startups. I sold an e-commerce, and I sold a software company, and I sold a real estate venture, and I sold an advertisement company. So it's very diverse. So I have never had a job. So I have never received a salary or something like that, which I hear it's amazing to allow someone else to get worried about how you're gonna get paid. But coming more to date, I got involved with more of the startup world through an organization called Startup Grind, which is based in the Bay Area. It's a very big community of startups. So I joined as the chapter director in Monterrey, Mexico, which is a city up north, close to Texas. Then I became country manager of Startup Grind in Mexico, and then I managed the whole region, Latin America. And then I became partner of Startup Grind. And in that path, many things happened. Among some of them, I created InDip, which is this consulting firm. We work with big corporations, usually global companies, to solve problems in a very agnostic way. Then I started for Founders in 2016, focusing on helping the bigger startups of different regions of the world. Most people assume that if you have a program to help startups, you should focus on early stage. But in fact, real ecosystems around the world, and this is something that we have seen in Startup Grind being present in 140 countries, is most of the ecosystems are built based on 1 or 2 companies that get really big and then have a liquidity event. And that's what built the ecosystem in much larger scale than having 1,000 startups. So I created for Founders to help our bigger startups to try to get them even bigger in 2016. And then this year, I am starting what you mentioned, Dissent Ventures, which is a venture capital firm, very, very focused on many different aspects that we're going to get into that in a bit. But we are trying to rewrite the whole book on venture capital, because regardless of being the asset class in the world which presume more innovation, more love to risk and everything, it's not true. It's something that hasn't changed at all in the last 20 years. The only minimal change is the crowdfunding, which is not really venture capital, but it's the only innovation around the asset class. So me and my partner Lina decided, hey, we need to remap this to try to make an assessment of what we do as venture capitalists and what we can improve by leaving the beliefs that the industry have.
Very cool and interesting. You said Startup Grind. I think their event, it was in April in Silicon Valley in Redwood City. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have our global conference there.
I think I was at that, actually. I might have seen you.
Probably, yeah.
Probably, if you only be known we were going to be talking today. So we've talked about 3 companies, Dissent Ventures, 4 Founders, and InDip. Do you have unique roles at each of them? And which one do you really, how do you generally allocate your time, since you can't be working 40-hour work weeks with all 3 of them?
No, and I work like 5 hours a day. Like that. I tend to think a little bit like an engineer. So I'm not an engineer. I am a lawyer by education. That doesn't mean anything in my life, but I study law. But how I think it is, I'm very good at 2 things. I'm very good at solving problems, and I'm very good at reimagining things,
Mm.
which are very similar talents. So that's what I do. So it doesn't matter the front end of how that is commercialized to the world, to say it somehow. I'm always doing the same,
I see.
solving problems or finding ways to reimagine things. So I wrote a book about human development, which is the same thing as a venture capital. For crazy that can sound, that's actually the same. So this is today how it's configured. My work life, this is configured like this. I have Indip, which is this consulting firm. We work with companies that have very large problems that usually they try to solve via one of the big four consulting firms.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have any kind of good results on solving that. So they come to us and we provide a completely different scenario, right? So that's one thing. So Indip today, we have around 30 employees. None of them is full-time. We are very focused on building like perfect teams for each project. So we have like this 30 people pool in which we usually arrange the teams. So that's one company. We are a very boutique consulting firm. So we don't have more than 5 clients every 6 months. Because how we scale in consulting is we aim to charge as much as possible, but not to get more clients. So our price tag increases, but we have never increased the price tag of the amount of clients in our consulting firm. So Indip, I am at Indip, the one that arms everybody's job. They give me everyone like their own Lego piece, and then I put everything together. So that takes me like 5 to 10 hours a week to do so. So then for founders, it's not a nonprofit in the legal matter, but we are not focusing on creating any kind of revenue. So for founders, we do these regional summits. We just did one in Colombia. We did one in Argentina, one in Mexico. We're planning to do Brazil and Chile later this year, and one in Spain. And the thing is the same. We need to optimize for founding the best startups according to our own metrics, which we're going to discuss, but it's very specific. And then getting the top investors from the world to watch those startups. And with that, 2 things will happen. The first one is they will find untapped potential on startups that are not the usual suspects. But in the other way, they're going to start understanding our way of thinking and rating startups. And then in Dissent Ventures, we are in the process of starting to fundraise for our own fund. So that's a very slow process. You have to go and get to know the LPs, work on trust, work on our value proposition. And then through the year, we're going to start, hopefully receive some direct investments on the fund. So there's nothing getting more than 20 or 30 hours a week for me today. So I'm pretty free in terms of work. And I love to have a life like that, because what we are doing is not measured in time, but in value we create for others.
Very cool. So let's talk about Dissent Ventures now. Just can you go give us some insights into the unique approach of Dissent Ventures?
Yeah, I will start with the tagline. So in Dissent Ventures, we invest in people that are changing a transaction for the first time in the way they are doing it. So most people is like, okay, give me 1 second, but you only have to forget about the industry and just try to hear what we are saying, right? So we invest in people. So this is the first big difference. We are not proactively looking for what the status quo calls startup. So we're looking for people that choose a transaction, and then that transaction, they are transforming it by adding a new stakeholder, by making it more efficient, by making it better. But that's the first time that it's transforming that matter. So a good example is, for example, Airbnb. It's a good example of it. So usually you used to have in the travel industry, the client, the platform, and the hotels. And that was it. That was the transaction. So at some time, Airbnb comes, see that transaction, and they are like, okay, you know what? It's not very efficient, because all the control on the resources being rented are controlled by a very small amount of people. And on top of that, you have a lot of real estate that is not being used at the present moment.
Mhm.
So we're going to rearrange the transaction, and instead of just having the hotel owners, we're going to add regular people with regular properties that have the capacity to assign those properties to the market, to the short-term rental market. So they remap the transaction. Now the transaction is not just about hotels, platform, and client. Now you have client, platform, hotels, and property owners. So that's very specific. It seems rather common, but in reality, it's really uncommon. So you have, like, for instance, Amazon selling books, then everybody that sells books after that, they're not transforming the transaction.
Right.
They are using an existing transaction. So
Yeah.
that's the first big thing around what we are focusing. So then, as a waterfall, you have different things that happen because you are following the transaction, not the business opportunity, not the size of the market, but the transaction. So the second thing is, most of the venture capital investors focus on a very specific metric, which is traction.
Mhm.
So the usual, if anybody in the audience have fundraised for a startup, they have go through this path in which a lot of investors will tell you, you know what, I like your company, but it's too early. Come back and look for me in a year when you have more sales, when you have more clients. And the thing with that sounds good, but in reality, we made a big analysis of data, and the data shows that there is no correlation between early traction and success rate. So we ask, where is this traction belief come from? And it's like, yeah, it's fairly easy. It comes from different asset classes, particularly banking. So if you go to a bank tomorrow and you ask for a credit for your business, the most important metric for the bank is how many clients do you have, and how much are you selling. That, like, by far is the most important metric. Most of the other metrics are secondaries. So that is because banks are usually lending money to existing business that are already operating at somehow with some level of penetration of the market and some level of development. But when you move to startups, that's not true. You are not investing in business that are established. They don't know if the market is bigger or not. They have a lot of uncertainties. So it's very rare to have, or to use the same metric that a bank uses to loan money, to use for startups that are supposed or allegedly have to be organizations that have a completely different scenario for growth. So what we did is, if traction doesn't matter, if you're selling today 50 subscriptions to a software, or 75, because me as a venture capital, I'm looking for you to sell 70,000, it doesn't matter if you're selling 20 more or 20 less. It's irrelevant. So instead of that, because we're focusing on a transaction, what we decided is, what if we can give a bigger value to the product or the service sophistication? So everybody's like, okay, what's the sophistication? And it's exactly, that's the thing. Because for us, you can look at very specific product in the market that are very sophisticated: Salesforce, Stripe, Amazon, which for us, it has a very brief description, and it's like, you have a product 10,000 times better than it needs to be, instead of the other way around. Instead of having a very, very limited product that it's almost not enough just to be as small as possible. So now we are assessing sophistication of the product. So the basic form of seeing that is, if you want to run a marathon in 2 years, it would be crazy to see how you can run today the 43 kilometers of a marathon. My thing would be, Mark, okay, if you have 2 years to prepare for a marathon, you should be running today maybe 1, 2, or 3 kilometers. Let's see how good your performance are in that stage, and let's see your training plan, and let's see how committed you are to become that athlete. And that's what we rate, because when you aggregate data, that do have a good correlation with success, right?
Yeah.
So that's the second thing we are changing in a big way. So we have no interest on how much traction do you have. We have no interest about how many clients do you have. We're deeply interested in two things. One is the belief you have. So usually you have a big belief against the status quo, which, for instance, even today, Mark, most people in the world, in middle class and upper class, know what Airbnb is. You know, like it's pretty common now these days, even in places like Mexico or Latin America. But even today, when you hear the premise of in which Airbnb was created, it doesn't fit very well in our mindset. So if I tell you someone is going to stay at your place, everything is going to be fine. You know the person, you don't have anybody in common with that person, but that person is going to stay, and 99.9% of the times, everything is going to work out perfect. Most of us would be like, oh, you know what? I don't know. Like,
I know.
You know, but it's something that is widely proven. So when we analyze a startup, our first question is, tell us about your belief. Tell us what you know or what you think most people in the world are wrong about it. The same happened with Uber, right? Uber was like, okay, I think a lot of people would like to have an app to ask for a car. Well, most people would be like, I don't think so. You can raise your hand and you're going to have a cab. Yeah, there are cities that are widely more complex, but in aggregate in the world, at that moment, that was pretty reasonable. Like if you were in Mexico City, the amount of cabs was like huge. Like you raise your hand at that moment and you'll see like 7 cabs try to fight for you. So you have no problem, right? But then someone like the co-founders of Uber come and say like, no, I do think people, the fact is people doesn't know that they want this, but me, I do know. And usually that has to have like a last name integrated, which is, okay, you think you know this, but tell me why you have that, Vinod Khosla called that an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
How many insight do you have and how deep and sophisticated is that insight? That's why you have such an advantage on building that insight. So that's also really uncommon, especially in funds in Latin America or emerging countries. Most of them want to invest in what we called everyday technology. So think of a really, really typical transaction for someone, and you just add a very small component of commoditized technology. That's what they want to invest because it feels safer. It's like, okay, instead of you going to Walmart to do your shopping, well, I have an app that will do the shopping for you. And that's like, okay, that sounds awesome. But in reality, that it's very far-fetched in changing behavior in people. So for us, that is not changing a transaction. That's something that happens already. So those are like the very first upfront differences that we're trying to change. And it's funny because most people in the traditional venture capital industry is like, oh, okay, that's going to be hard and sounds complicated. But the great advantage of venture capital is that it's such a huge risk that you cannot get a lot worse odds.
Right.
You know, like it's like, imagine you are like, okay, I love buying lottery tickets. And someone tells you, hey, Mark, if you buy them on Sunday, it's better for you to win. It doesn't matter that much if you believe it or not, but just because it's so unlikely for you to win the lottery, that even you playing with something, it's much more probable that you're gonna get better odds instead of getting worse odds. So that's the first part of what we're doing.
Very, very interesting. It's certainly not the Silicon Valley model. And you didn't once mention recurring revenue, I noticed. So let's switch to your Latin American industries now, which correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you're doing with 4 Founders, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So you just give us some, what is your role in helping these different startups with 4 Founders?
Well, it's actually pretty similar. So historically in Latin America, which I think it's very repetitive around the world, it depends on the stage of the ecosystem. But I like to think in the first stages of an ecosystem, entrepreneurial startups ecosystem, like the first generation are these people that are actually going crazy with an idea that has nothing to do with reality, sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. That's the first generation. You see like a much nicer set of outcasters, to call it somehow. But then the second generation or the second stage comes, and that's the stage we are today in Latin America, which is, okay, it seems like these things, startups work. I have heard about a couple of people that have made it. Okay, let's figure this out, because most of the founders in this second stage are people that are already professionals in some way. They are in consulting, they're working for a company or something. So now they want to try to hack entrepreneurship. So you start seeing a lot of people being really opportunistic. So the example I like to share is, imagine in your neighborhood, you don't have a bread store. You know, like you don't have a bread store, you know, and it's a pretty good assumption that people buys bread. So you're like, okay, man, like it seems like a good opportunity. No one sells bread in San Francisco. I'm gonna put a bread store, a bakery. But then it's like, okay, Mark, do you know anything about bread? And it's like, no. Okay, Mark, do you like bread? No. Do you understand bread at all? No. But it's a good opportunity. So you start to have this huge amount of entrepreneurs, of founders of startups that have random startups. And some work and some doesn't, but they're not sophisticated. Because if you want to have the most amazing bread store in San Francisco, I can bet if you find the woman, the man owning that bread, that bakery, she's gonna be deeply in love with bread.
Yeah.
You won't find the best bakery in San Francisco to be owned by a guy who hates bread, doesn't care about bread. You know, like that doesn't happen, and doesn't happen for a reason. And at the end, we are very human, everyone, and it's very basic how we function. So for founders, what we're trying to do is pushing the third stage of Latin America. Where are those bread makers who are absolutely in love with bread? Where are them? Because we have a lot of people making bread, but they don't like bread. They don't appreciate bread. They don't know how to do the best bread, but they are just capitalizing on the fact that people don't have other options to buy bread.
Yeah.
So that we're doing with For Founders is finding these people deeply sophisticated. And the amazing thing about how Latin America is today is that now a lot of VCs in the US wants to invest in the best bread makers of Latin America. So with For Founders, we are connecting the best bread makers in Latin America with funds like Dissent Ventures or Sequoia, like these big names. It's not that we are like scouting for them or anything official. What we are doing is finding these sophisticated startups, and through someone we know in the funds, sending those startups their way. Also for them to have a better understanding of Latin America and start seeing how there are better founders and better entrepreneurs. So it aligns perfectly with the fund, because at the same moment we're doing the same thing, trying to find these amazing, sophisticated founders that are completely outcasted from the startup ecosystem because they have this huge idea of startup. They have a sophisticated product, but they haven't been able even to know who's going to be your client, which seems for a lot of people crazy. But for me, it's like, for instance, we have among our network of companies, a company that is creating like a capsule for seeds. And this capsule, the objective of the capsule is being able to transform seeds to be grown in every weather around the world. So the belief with which we talk about, the belief of this company is weather should not matter. What should matter is what you need to be growing. in each country, in each city. So that's a huge premise. So they're working on the prototype. We have no idea who's going to be the client. We don't know if the client are going to be like these huge companies, Monsanto style. We don't know if this is going to be like a government thing that they promote. Like, but it's okay not to know, because if this works, if we manage to get that to port, it's going to be so big that money is going to flow. Like if you are the number one company transforming agriculture around the world, it's crazy to think, well, if you don't have clients, you should go with your capsules and try to sell a couple of them on Amazon. And it's like, what are you talking about? We're talking about changing a transaction completely. So the final belief in Dissent Ventures is, what we are doing is, instead of looking and aiming for early success, very relative, because it's not success at all, it's just, it looks like it's working. We are assuming that in venture capital, you need to wait at least 3 or 5 years to see some real success. So instead of pushing you to do something soon, we are optimizing for you to run your marathon in 5 years, which is our deadline. We don't need you to run the marathon in 3 weeks, because it doesn't work. The race is in 5 years, so I need you to go and win the race. I don't care if you are able to run a marathon tomorrow. It's completely irrelevant for us.
Very cool. And then now we'll switch to In Deep. And I'm just curious, who is your typical client with In Deep? Is it small to medium, or is it more the large Fortune 100 companies?
Usually we have worked mostly with 500 Fortune companies, because what we do is we like, and we are experts on solving problems. So this is the first situation. So we solve problems, which is uncommon for the consulting firms to solve problems, which, again, it doesn't sound very clear. But most consulting firms, their main objective is to please the client, because they want to stay as long as possible with a retainer of a client. For us, we are much more similar to a doctor. So if you go to a doctor, Mark, and the doctor tell you like, hey, Mark, I'm sorry, but you have diabetes. What would happen if you are like, oh, no, doctor, you know what? No, I don't like diabetes. You have something else? No doctor is going to be like, okay, Mark, you're right. Okay, no diabetes. You have the flu. And you're going to be, okay, I like that. That sounds good. Yeah. Well, that's how much the majority of the consulting firms work. And it's very simple to understand it, because you are the owner of your company. You go and hire a consulting firm, and you tell them like, hey, my company in the last 2 years has been losing clients everywhere. And I don't know why. Can you help me solve this? And there you have your first big challenge as a company, as a consulting company, because, and this is a very funny analogy, because if you're married and you go to a couples therapy with your wife, with your partner, and you tell them both, like, hey, we have problems on our marriage. What's the first thing that the therapist is going to say? Is like, okay, let's see what you're doing wrong. Imagine if your answer, Mark, was like, I don't know, that has nothing to do with us. You're going to be like, what do you mean? If you have problems with your wife in your marriage, well, you only have 2 parts that are responsible for it. So when you go to a company and the CEO hires you and he tells you you're losing clients, if you're honest, which we are in our consulting firm, it's like, okay, Mark, do you understand that you are a huge part of the problem? Are you ready to have that conversation? So most consulting firms doesn't do it.
Right.
So they try to bypass around the obvious. So when they don't solve it, and a client comes to us, which is usually a company, like we work with the biggest fashion company in the world, we work with some of the biggest construction company in Latin America, like very big clients, and they are like putting on the table this big problem with the fashion company. They have a very high rotation personnel on the stores. Like a lot of people keeps like leaving the work and everything, and it's like, okay, who's in charge of this? Oh no, she's amazing. She doesn't have anything to do with the problem. It's like, okay, I'm here to solve the problem. So we work with those companies. We have very funny rules with our clients. So rule number one is we're just going to work for 6 months. That's it. No extension, no new retainer, because the fact that you're hiring me to solve the problem means I am here to do so. And if you don't find it important and a priority, it's not going to happen. And I know you don't care, as strange as it sounds, but most people doesn't care that their company have problems. But I do care, because you're going to go to someone else and you're going to say like, hey, yeah, we hired Indeed and nothing happened. Now, if that happens, if that's the case, I'm going to go and tell like, yeah, we have 6 months. They never provide the information. They never commit to the changes we decided. So we abandon the company. So 6 months, we are out. Second clause is we are not here to micromanage you. So we have very strict rules. We ask for information for the company, and we have 48 hours to receive the information. And then we put the project into kind of a stalemate. So we're not going to move forward until you send the information, and you'll get 0 reminders. Because it's your problem. You should be worried. It's like a doctor trying to remind you that you need to go to chemotherapy. It's like, man, like it's your life. Like you cannot rely on the doctors being preoccupied because you're not getting your treatment. You should be the one, right? Like
absolutely.
And the last thing that we do is like, okay, we are here to solve the problem. We are here to cure the patient. So that's the objective. And that means it's gonna have a lot of repercussions, as any patient that have gone through a treatment know. And that's it. So we're gonna work on that. So most of our clients find the process a bit hard, but at the end they are like, okay, now I understand why our processes never work with the Big Four.
Yeah.
Because the Big Four is gonna be very, very pleasant with you all the time. I'm gonna try to please you.
Long time.
Yeah.
They do.
And
everyone
knows. And they will promote different things like, okay, you don't want to work in your diabetes. Okay, let's work in a little flu you have. Well, let's work. And as long as you have a retainer on them, like they're super happy and they have no hurry.
Yeah.
So
very cool.
That's it.
And fine, we're going to finish up. And if you just want to touch on what you're doing with Professional Woman and your For Women Forum.
In For Women Forum, we created that. I have no intent of being a person that knows about gender, but For Women was born because I know about communities. In Startup Grind, we have built around 600 communities around the world, not myself, a bunch of people. I'm just a very, very small part of it. But I learned about communities. I developed a framework to develop communities. I tested in different entrepreneurial ecosystems, but entrepreneurs are not a good audience to test something because they are very, they are very intense and they are very, they really want things to happen. So they are not a good market to test that. So at some point in my life, we have in Startup Grind what it calls a Women Founder Month. So we start brainstorming a lot about how to get more women involved in startups and our events. And I got a very small expertise on what women valued in 2015 when meeting with other women, right? So we tried everything. And the thing that works the best was women wanted to go to events, to startup events, where they have a very good amount of certainty that more women would attend. So it doesn't matter if you brought the best female founder in the world. If they didn't know, it was very probable to not be the only woman in the audience, which is the basic thing in startup events. So we understood that, I understood that. And then for women, I founded something interesting that was most gender-focused events works on the, if you are an activist, like in activism, or in super role models, most powerful women. So what we did is, let's work with the middle. We are not all activists. We are not all super powerful women, but we are a bit activist and a bit powerful. So that's what we're doing, and we're helping them to become more secure and more connected to try to help them get a better work-life balance.
Very cool. So I want to thank you, Pablo, for your time today. It's been great talking to you. You're doing a lot of great things down there in Latin America, and hopefully you keep doing it. And next time you're in San Francisco, let's get together.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was a pleasure. It was a small brief of everything that has happened in my 40 plus years. But thank you very much for everything, and happy to be part of your project.